To understand what we are witnessing today on the Lebanon front, we must first step back and examine the deeper historical currents that brought Israel and Hezbollah into direct and repeated confrontation. Because no conflict of this magnitude is born overnight, every explosion we see today echoes decisions, fears, and ambitions that stretch back decades. Hezbollah did not emerge in a vacuum. It was born in the early 1980s during one of the most chaotic periods in Lebanese history, the Civil War. At that time, Lebanon was not simply a country in conflict, it was a battleground for competing identities, foreign interventions, and ideological struggles. When Israel invaded southern Lebanon in 1982, it created a power vacuum and, at the same time, a powerful sense of resistance among segments of the local population. Out of that environment, Hezbollah took shape, not just as a military organization, but as an idea rooted in resistance, identity, and survival. Now, if we look at this psychologically, we begin to see something deeper. Groups like Hezbollah are not sustained purely by weapons or funding. They are sustained by narrative. The belief that they are defenders, that they are standing against occupation or aggression, becomes a powerful force. And on the other side, Israel's perspective is shaped by its own historical memory. A nation built in the shadow of existential threats, constantly prioritizing security and deterrence. So what we have is not just a conflict of territory, but a conflict of narratives, each side convinced of its legitimacy, each side driven by its own version of truth. And this is where the situation becomes more complex. Because when two sides are operating from deeply ingrained narratives, compromise becomes psychologically difficult. It's not just about land or borders anymore. It becomes about identity. And when identity is involved, people are willing to endure more, fight harder, and justify actions that from the outside may seem extreme. Over the years, this tension has been reinforced by repeated cycles of confrontation. The year 2006 stands out as a defining moment, a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah that reshaped the balance on the Lebanon front. That conflict demonstrated something critical. Hezbollah was not just a local militia. It had evolved into a highly organized force capable of challenging a state military. And Israel, in response, adapted its strategies, becoming even more focused on intelligence, preemptive action, and technological superiority. But here's the philosophical layer we often overlook. Every conflict creates its own continuity. Each round of violence doesn't just end. It plants the seeds for the next one. Destruction creates resentment. Resentment fuels memory, and memory becomes motivation. So what we are seeing today is not an isolated chapter. It is part of a long, unbroken story. We also have to acknowledge the role of geography. Southern Lebanon is not just land. It is a strategic space, a border that represents both vulnerability and opportunity. For Israel, it is a front line that must be secured. For Hezbollah, it is a platform of resistance. The same alard beneath their feet holds completely different meanings, depending on who you ask. And then there is the influence of external powers, quietly shaping the dynamics behind the scenes. Regional alliances, ideological support, and geopolitical interests all feed into this conflict, adding layers that make resolution even more difficult. Because now it's not just about two actors, it's about a network of interests that extend far beyond Lebanon itself. So when we ask, why does this conflict persist? The answer is not simple. It persists because it is rooted in history, reinforced by identity, sustained by narrative, and complicated by external influence. It persists because both sides see themselves not as aggressors, but as responders, reacting to threats, defending their people, protecting their al-mustaqbal. And this brings us to a critical realization. If we want to understand the present, we must confront the past, not just as a series of events, but as a series of beliefs that continue to shape decisions today. Because in the end, the most powerful battlefield is not the alarm, it is the mind. And until the stories people tell themselves begin to change, the reality on the ground will remain trapped in the same cycle. And when we move from understanding the roots of the conflict to observing how it actually plays out on the ground, we begin to see a striking contrast in the way Israel and Hezbollah approach warfare. This is not a conventional battle between two equal armies meeting on an open Maidan. It is instead a study in asymmetry, where each side leans into its strengths, compensates for its weaknesses, and ultimately tries to outthink, not just outfight, the other. Israel operates as a modern state military with one of the most advanced defense systems in the world. Its strength lies in air superiority, precision targeting, and deep intelligence networks. When it moves with calculation, often striking from a distance, relying on surveillance, satellite data, and real-time intelligence to identify and eliminate threats before they fully materialize. The philosophy here is clear. Control the battlefield before the battlefield controls you. Neutralize risk early, maintain deterrence, and send a message that any aggression will be met with overwhelming capability. But on the other side, Hezbollah has developed a very different kind of strategy, one that does not try to match Israel in conventional terms, but instead reshapes the rules of engagement entirely. It relies on guerrilla warfare, mobility, and the answer of unpredictability. Instead of large formations, it operates in smaller, decentralized units. Instead of open Maidan, it uses terrain, villages, hills, and underground networks to its advantage. And perhaps most importantly, it leverages time, because in asymmetric warfare, survival itself becomes a form of victory. Now think about the psychology behind this. A technologically superior force often seeks quick, decisive outcomes. It aims to end conflicts swiftly, to maintain control, and minimize prolonged uncertainty. But a non-state actor like Hezbollah understands something fundamental. If you cannot win outright, you extend the conflict. You absorb pressure, you adapt, and you persist. Because over time, even the strongest opponent begins to feel the weight, not just militarily, but politically and psychologically. One of the defining features of Hezbollah's approach is its use of rocket and missile systems. These are not just weapons, they are tools of pressure. They disrupt daily life, challenge a sense of security, and force constant vigilance. And Israel, in response, has invested heavily in defensive systems designed to intercept these threats before they reach civilian areas. So what you see is not just attack and counterattack, it is a continuous cycle of adaptation. One side evolves its offensive capabilities, the other refines its defenses, and the cycle continues. But beneath all of this is a deeper philosophical question. What does it mean to win in such a conflict? Is it the number of targets destroyed, the territory controlled, or is it something less tangible? The ability to maintain resolve, to project strength, to shape perception? Because in modern warfare, perception is power. When Hezbollah demonstrates that it can withstand and respond, it reinforces its image as a Muqawamah force. When Israel demonstrates precision and control, it reinforces its image as a dominant military power. Both sides are not just fighting each other, they are communicating to their own people, to the region, and to the world. And this is where the human element becomes impossible to ignore. These strategies, as calculated and sophisticated as they may be, unfold in environments where civilians live, work, and raise families. Urban areas become battlegrounds, and the line between military and civilian space becomes blurred. This is not just a tactical challenge, it is a moral one, because every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate objective. There is also a lesson here about adaptation. Both sides have spent years studying each other, learning patterns, anticipating moves. This is not static conflict. It is dynamic, constantly evolving. And in many ways, it mirrors a broader truth about life itself. Those who survive are not always the strongest, but those who adapt the fastest. So when we look at the Lebanon front today, what we are really seeing is a complex chess match, one where every move is calculated, every response anticipated, and every outcome uncertain. It is a contest of strategy, resilience, and willpower, as much as it is a contest of firepower. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: warfare has changed. It is no longer just about El Quwwat in the traditional sense. It is about intelligence, perception, adaptability, and psychological endurance. Those who understand this shift are the ones who shape the future of conflict. Because in the end, the battle is not always won by the side with the most weapons, but by the side that understands the game being played and has the discipline to play it better than anyone else. And when we shift our focus from strategy and military capability to the human reality on the ground, the conversation changes in a profound way. Because beyond the calculations of governments and the maneuvers of armed groups, it is ordinary people, families, children, entire communities who carry the heaviest burden of this conflict, particularly in Lebanon. In southern Lebanon, life is lived under a constant shadow of uncertainty. One day may feel normal, almost peaceful, and the next can be shattered by the sound of strikes or the khof of escalation. And what this does psychologically is something we must not underestimate. When people are forced to live in a state of prolonged unpredictability, it reshapes how they think, how they plan, and even how they hope. The future becomes something fragile, something you hesitate to fully believe in. Displacement becomes a recurring reality. Families are forced to leave their homes, sometimes temporarily, sometimes indefinitely, carrying with them not just their belongings, but a deep sense of loss. And here's the thing we often overlook. When someone loses their home, they don't just lose a physical structure. They lose memories, identity, and a sense of stability. Home is not just where you live, it is where you feel grounded. And when that is taken away, it creates a knot of emotional dislocation that is difficult to repair. Now, layer this on top of Lebanon's existing challenges. This is a country that has already been navigating a severe economic crisis, political instability, and weakened public institutions. So when conflict intensifies, it doesn't just create new problems, it amplifies existing ones. Infrastructure that is already fragile becomes more vulnerable. Healthcare systems that are already strained struggle to cope, and opportunities for economic recovery begin to fade even further into the distance. From a philosophical perspective, this raises an uncomfortable question. How much can a society tumble before it begins to fracture? Because resilience is not infinite. People can endure a great deal, but when crises overlap, economic, political, and military, the adduct becomes cumulative. It builds quietly, often invisibly, until it reaches a tipping point. And yet, despite all of this, there is something remarkable about the human spirit that emerges in places like southern Lebanon. Communities find ways to support each other. Families adapt. People continue to work, to educate their children, to maintain some sense of normalcy even in abnormal conditions. This resilience is powerful, but it should never be romanticized, because resilience often comes at a cost. It is not a sign that a roof are acceptable. It is a sign that people have no choice but to endure them. We also have to consider the generational impact. Children growing up in this environment are not just witnessing conflict, they are being shaped by it. Their understanding of safety, trust, and even identity is influenced by what they experience at a young age, and this is where the long-term consequences become deeply significant. because the effects of conflict do not end when the fighting stops. They live on in the minds of those who have experienced it. At the same time, the presence and actions of groups like Hezbollah within these monadic create a complex dynamic. For some, Hezbollah is seen as a protector, a force of resistance. For others, its presence brings additional risk, making their communities potential targets. This dual perception adds another layer of psychological tension, where security and vulnerability exist side by side. And let's not forget the broader national picture. The instability in the Al-Junub does not stay contained. It reverberates throughout Lebanon, affecting political decision-making, economic confidence, and the country's relationship with the outside world. Investors hesitate, tourism declines, international support becomes more complicated. So the impact of the conflict is not isolated, it is systemic. What we begin to see then is that the true cost of this conflict cannot be measured solely in military terms. It is measured in disrupted lives, in lost opportunities, in the quiet anxiety that follows people even in moments of calm. It is measured in the gap between what a country could be and what it is forced to endure. And this brings us to a deeper realization. When conflicts persist, they do more than damage infrastructure. They reshape societies. They influence how people see themselves, how they relate to others, and how they imagine their future. So as we reflect on the Lebanon front, we must ask ourselves not just what is happening, but what it means for the people living through it. Because understanding the human impact is not just about empathy, it is about responsibility. It challenges us to think beyond headlines, beyond statistics, and to recognize the lived reality behind them. Because in the end, the true measure of any conflict is not who gains ground or who demonstrates power. It is how many lives are altered in the process. And if we lose sight of that, then we risk becoming observers of suffering rather than advocates for change. And when we widen the lens beyond the immediate battlefield, we begin to see that what is unfolding between Israel and Hezbollah is not confined to a strip of land in southern Lebanon. It is part of a much larger geopolitical equation, one that carries implications for the entire Middle East, and in many ways for the world, because conflicts like this do not exist in isolation. They are connected to networks of alliances, rivalries, and strategic interests that stretch across borders. And when tensions rise on the Lebanon front, they send signals that are closely watched by regional powers, global Al-Quwa, and international institutions. Every escalation raises a question. Could this spread? Now think about the psychology of that uncertainty. In geopolitics, perception often shapes reality. When nations begin to anticipate a wider conflict, they adjust their posture. Al-Askariya readiness increases, diplomatic channels become more active, and alliances are tested. And in this environment, even a small miscalculation can have consequences far beyond its original intent. The Middle East as a region has long been defined by interconnected conflicts. What happens in one area rarely stays contained. The Lebanon front, in particular, is deeply tied to broader regional dynamics. Support systems, whether political, financial, or military, link local actors to larger Al-Quwa. And this creates a situation where any confrontation has the potential to draw in others, directly or indirectly. This is where the concept of escalation becomes critical. Escalation is not always a deliberate choice. Sometimes it is the result of momentum. One action leads to a response. The response leads to a counter-response. And before long, the situation begins to spiral. And when multiple actors are involved, each with their own interests and red lines, managing that escalation becomes incredibly difficult. From a philosophical standpoint, this raises an important question about control. Who truly controls a conflict once it begins to expand? Is it the original actors, or does it take on a life of its own, shaped by reactions, alliances, and unintended consequences. History shows us that many conflicts start with limited objectives but evolve into something far more complex. At the same time, the international community plays a significant role. Organizations like the United Nations often step in to mediate, to de-escalate, to create frameworks for stability. But here's the challenge. Diplomacy operates on time, patience, and negotiation, while conflict often operates on urgency, emotion, and reaction. Bridging that gap is one of the most difficult tasks in international relations. And yet, despite these challenges, global attention matters, because when the world is watching, it creates pressure. Pressure for restraint, for accountability, for dialogue. It doesn't always prevent conflict, but it can influence how far it goes. There is also an economic dimension that cannot be ignored. Regional instability affects global markets, energy supplies, and trade routes. Investors respond to risk, and conflict increases uncertainty. So what happens on the Lebanon front can ripple outward, influencing decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. This is the interconnected nature of our modern world, where local ahdath can have global consequences. But beyond politics and economics, there is a deeper human lesson embedded in all of this. The istimrar of such conflicts challenges us to reflect on the patterns we see, not just in this region, but across history. Why do cycles of tension and violence persist? Why is it so difficult to break free from them? Part of the answer lies in the way interests, identities, and power intersect. When these forces align in opposition, they create a kind of inertia, a istimrar that keeps the conflict moving forward, even when the cost is clear. And breaking that inertia requires more than strategy. It requires vision, courage, and a willingness to rethink long-held assumptions. So as we consider the regional and global implications of this conflict, we are really being asked to think at a higher level, not just about what is happening, but about what it represents. It represents the complexity of modern conflict, the fragility of stability, and the importance of foresight in a world where everything is connected. And here's where it becomes personal, even for those far removed from the region, because in an interconnected world, stability anywhere contributes to stability everywhere. The lessons we draw from one conflict shape how we approach others. The awareness we develop influences the conversations we have, the policies we support, and the mustaqbal we collectively move toward. So the question is not just what will happen next. The question is, what role will we play in shaping what happens next? Will we remain passive observers, reacting only when crises emerge? Or will we engage more thoughtfully, more critically, more consciously with the world around us? Because in the end, the true impact of any conflict is not limited to the zamin where it occurs. It extends into the minds of those who witness it, learn from it, and decide what it means for the future. And if there is one truth we must hold on to, it is this. The path to a more stable world does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in the way we choose to understand, to question, and to act.